Are we becoming illiberal?
Supposed guardians of liberalism. You can take something like Biden, proclaiming that he's protecting Palestinians, right? If that's a friend, who needs an enemy, right?
What actually the word enlightenment means and the anti-enlightenment means.
It's a really strong idea that you need context and you need comparison, getting our stuff through Amazon, but we're also selling all of our preferences and we're being herded in our preferences.
In the far south Asia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, countries like those have sold their like those airports are not their own anymore.
Right.
The main infrastructure, the ports, the ships, where there can be US Navy or the Chinese military, those are owned by those countries. They don't own them anymore, their own land.
Cryptocurrency can be one of those places where people put their money, right? So there is a lot of innovation in this area. Electronic yuan. So there, the Chinese government is trying to get around this massive system, very expensive system that's attached to global trade. One of the arguments is that the sort of war in Ukraine has, because the US is no longer very reliable.
What does global economy look like right now? Hi there, good afternoon, Dr. Mara.
Good afternoon, Jainil. It's nice to be here having a conversation with you.
Awesome. It's my pleasure. First of all, thank you so much for doing this favor and giving us the time for our podcast show. So I'll give you the basic outline that my aim is to actually send the important message, knowledge, impart the wisdom for the people who have ambition, whether it's young minds or the other people who want to switch lines in their careers, and just spread the knowledge, whatever I can from my perspective. So thank you so much for doing this today. So basically, she is a PhD in Sociology and Criminology. She heads that faculty at University of Manitoba, and she will be able to give you some research, what she's doing right now.
Right. Hi.
So can you give me some, what research are you right now completing?
The projects that I'm completing right now. So one of the major things that I've been doing is I teach theory in sociology, and theory is very important to sociology. And one of the reasons why is because I'm going to argue it's an Enlightenment science. And so that means it has, the view of science is quite different from what people might be used to, but it's really rooted in history. So that the kind of view of science is something that can incorporate things like qualitative data, can incorporate historical data, historical documents data, archival data, as well as the kind of way we've come to think of science over time. And I'm going to argue, because of imperial intervention, we've come to reduce science to a concept that's very mechanistic. So that's the term we use. So things are supposed to have mechanical relationships in order to study them with science. So we think of white lab coats and lab rats and things like that as science. But the view of science that sociology developed out of is a lot broader. So it can include a lot of quantitative analysis, but it also includes qualitative analysis. The point is to bring together knowledge from different perspectives and to be able to and have that empirical basis, bring it in front of the community of scholars. So that community of scholars is supposed to be independent, keeping each other responsible. And in terms of good methods, feedback, in terms of really trying to build a knowledge from different positions all over the world, right? So, and from different social statuses, so that we come to understand our very, very complex world from all sorts of different perspectives. And we're bringing that together. And so what theory does in this version of science, this Enlightenment version of science, is theory kind of aggregates that knowledge after it's kind of gone through the community of scientists and they've gotten their feedback and kind of improved and gotten different perspectives. And theory is kind of a living thing. It continuously is improved by different perspectives. The world is always changing, so we have new information. So I'm a theory prof in sociology, and so what I'm trying to do is look at how our ways of knowing have changed over time. So both in what we think of as science proper, I have a background in biology and complex ecology, as well as literature and as well in sociology. I have my PhD in sociology, but I did a lot of work in graduate school and in undergrad in biology. And so I'm very, very interested in how the science has moved in both disciplines, kind of comparing them and understanding a little bit better about how our knowledge has been impacted by changes in the world, right? Whether that's climate change or imperialism, all sorts of dynamics of change, right? And that has impacted how we understand the world.
So, would you want to enlighten on what actually the word enlightenment means and the anti-enlightenment means before we dive deeper into that, and give me some examples of how in the past events the things has changed, those events has changed the thinking of humans, how the intervention of, I would say, authoritative big people have manipulated the understanding as well.
Yeah. So, so when I talk about enlightenment, I talk about it's a movement that many of us associate with the West, right? So we associate it with the revolutionary period or the period leading up to the revolutionary period. We associate it with the 17th century and the 18th century. And there's a lot of struggle in Europe that we can trace to the ways in which the peasantry in Europe was defeated in a lot of wars, so that you have a kind of slavery condition in Europe. But it's not sustainable. It's a lot of conflict. And so there's kind of this kind of swell, right? This kind of social swell. And it gets lit off by the Renaissance, where old texts are discovered and people realize through that comparative lens of being able to look at old texts that people have lived differently and had different thoughts, and some of them are democratic. And what I mean by democratic will also come into play in terms of enlightenment. It's this idea, and I really recommend the recent book by Kevin Mitchell about agency. So it's this idea that what life is, including human life, is we are all agents. And so what's really important is that we're allowed to develop our potentials, our capacities, and be able to realize that agency, even as individuals, or as we say in biology, organisms. But we ought to be able to develop our capacities so that we can thrive, prosper, thrive our whole lives long. And the trick with humans is we're social. So part of developing our agency as individuals is we have to work together, right? So the Enlightenment is a way of taking those old ideas that are being recovered in the Renaissance about democracy, about the need for all humans to thrive and develop their agency and their capacities, and to try to figure out new ways of knowing, new ways of governing, new ways of exchanging ideas, information, and grievances, as the great Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Dewey once talked about. So an enlightenment is, I already described science. So that's a really important part of enlightenment's conception of knowledge. So it's a really strong idea that you need context and you need comparison to be able to understand how well and intervene responsibly in a way that supports everybody's agential development and thriving. You need to be able to understand context in order to make those interventions, those scientific discoveries that are still responsible to human thriving.
So, in simple terms, if I was to go back to around the era of French Revolution and everything, and provide some example, would it be like people like us are peasants, and there are monasteries who were ruling, and they would approach the peasants as normal peasantry, and they made them do slavery. But at the after that, there was a time when they discovered those old scriptures and texts, and then they did a revolution, and that's how the monasteries, the that era came down, and then people started living differently. But what interesting thing is, many people do think that even now there is that type of peasantry monastery structure, monarch structure, but it's just in a different way.
Yeah. So I think that there's something interesting to that too. So the one way of talking about this is the Enlightenment has never been complete, and it's never just been European. So one of the major falsehoods, a way of containing our idea of the Enlightenment, is to misrecognize who's contributed to it. So fundamentally, people all over the world have contributed to it. There is great work. David Graeber has looked at how in Madagascar and other countries, right, in South Asia, there were massive kind of contributions that were both rebellious and also contributing to knowledge, right? That knowledge base of different ways of living and a different innovative imagination of ways of living together that could support everybody's human development, as opposed to sacrificing some people as feudal serfs so that other people could have basically their agency would be transferred up the social hierarchy, right, to priests and lords and ladies and kings and queens, right? So some people having way too much, they're kind of like over agency, right? And other people being completely deprived or basically being forced to give their agency up the social hierarchy. And the problem with that is it undercuts the conditions of thriving life, as Kevin Mitchell would say. So I guess in that sense, the Enlightenment has never been complete, right? It's gotten some way, and it's been, I think, one of the important things to emphasize that has been de-emphasized for about 80 years, if not more, is that the Enlightenment has always been under attack. So there's always been an anti-Enlightenment. And we have been living in 80 years where we imagined that everything just became the Enlightenment, and we blame all of society's and the world's ills on the Enlightenment, but that really makes invisible the anti-Enlightenment. It's inegalitarianism, it's radical inegalitarianism, it's the radically unequal society that it fights for, and the ways in which that has been violent, right? And suppressed the fundamental condition of enlightenment, which is to develop humans' knowledge and capacities all around the world so that they can share it and we can understand our world better, right?
So, in modern world, if we were to address many federalized bodies, institutions like U.S. Supreme Courts or the governments, European governments, many more world leaders, how do they reflect on the old ideas? How are they possibly the monarchs of the modern world?
Right.
And how do they react on this idea of enlightenment?
Right. So really good questions and a really great way of bringing it to the concrete present. Yeah. So a great example is what's happened in the U.S. in the judiciary and through an organization called the Federalist Society, and they're very consciously uh, a group that has formed around this concept of living together, a society that's highly unequal. And so the Federalists were some of the original founders of the they were some of the original founders of the U.S. state, right? They were part of making the Constitution. They were bankers. And so one of the things that they were really opposed to is democracy. They wanted to bring into the US some of the traditions of the British monarchy. And so a lot of, as we know, one way of thinking about the US government, the state, is it's kind of underdeveloped. It's like the first revolution, but it was already, you were getting hard breaks and hard limits on how much democracy could develop. So things like the judiciary were particularly built to limit democracy. And we can see now that's really because of the massive political mobilization, particularly of elites. So we can think of economic elites like the Koch brothers, the Scaife Foundation, the Olin Foundation. These are all foundations where, as we've seen, as we've built up massive economic inequality, and you have these big billionaire families, right? Like the Kochs, like Elon Musk and so forth. What they're doing by building up all this excess wealth, this excess agency, and taking it from just like billions of people around the world, what they're doing is they're buying themselves excess capacity to control politics and control the judiciary. So they funded the Federalist Society starting, I think, back in the, I think it was the late 70s. And by today, it has about 70,000 American lawyers involved in it. And the Federalist Society controls 5 members of the US Supreme Court were from this Federalist Society. Their whole agenda is de-democratization, inequality, inegalitarianism, anti-Enlightenment. And they use anti-Enlightenment tools like, say, for example, the Catholic legal tradition is really strong in thinking about the ways that people can live together under highly unequal conditions. So some of that has made its way into many law schools, definitely into the Federalist Society. Of course, the Federalists themselves were not, necessarily of that faith, but they were from a faith, banking, that really, really needs inequality, right?
So that's how they make their strength. So actually, what the world we are living in, so-called democratic, is not democratic. It's what the idea derived by them to keep us contained, limited to our potential.
Right.
So,
and misunderstanding what democratic could be, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So how to actually, make yourself capable and knowledgeable of those things and escape out of that box that they have made for us. So-called nowadays, many people address it as matrix created by those elitists. Many people address them as the Illuminati, the elitists of the society.
Oh, yeah.
So those are all fancy terms, but what actually we believe is definitely every rich family from all the parts of the world have made to the top, and we are not actually run by governments, we are actually run by them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the arguments that economists like Yanis Varoufakis are trying to make, right? Is that by having privatized things like technology that's so ubiquitous and that we need to use to relate to each other and even to express our culture, right? So technology like TikTok or what have you, or Amazon, right? We're getting our stuff through Amazon, but we're also selling all of our preferences, and we're being herded in our preferences, in who we become, right? By this technology that mediates our expression, both of our everyday lives and our cultures. So in that sense, companies like Amazon, Jeff Bezos basically, the whole algorithm of that company is about maximizing his welfare, right? So all the information that we're giving, like serfs, about who we are and who we can be, all that information that we're giving to Jeff Bezos, he's using to direct who we become, right?
Yes.
For his own gain. So I think that there's definitely, and that's another aspect of it, is what happened to U.S. finance when the U.S. dollar took over, right? So that basically created a kind of agreement around the world where the U.S. would stop producing things, other countries would produce things, sell them to the U.S., their country's capitalists would make the profit, but then have to invest that, because they're paid, it's all in dollars, have to invest that back into, and they wanted to do this, owning parts of the US, right? So owning real estate, owning more and more parts of the US. So this is one of these arrangements where there are big power players. One of them is like the capitalist, the Tata family, right, in India, for example. But another one is the US, right? By controlling the US dollar, US capitalists, US decision makers in the US's central bank, the Fed. They are really directing investment in other countries, what sort of infrastructure they can have. They're often forcing countries that have been underdeveloped in the global south to do things like sell all of their collective assets that people need to develop as humans, sell that to local oligarchs, who in turn use the profits to buy more U.S. land, and just sort of feudal kind of feudal behavior. So I would say there's a little bit of definitely capitalist control, and then also U.S. control based on the dollar for a long time. The point is that is changing.
But now, if I recall, nowadays, if I recall to the example that you gave, that US in the global south tries to manipulate a lot of things, try to buy out the assets that are important. One of those examples I recall is in the far south Asia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Countries like those have sold their like those airports are not their own anymore.
Right.
The main infrastructure, the ports, the ships, where there can be US Navy or the Chinese military, those are owned by those countries. They don't own them anymore, their own land.
Right. Yeah.
So those are one of the examples that can be driven from them. But nowadays, US dollar, we have seen that many other currencies are challenging. People in South they are using their own currency, started to own started to use their currencies locally, like Russia, like the Middle East, Middle East. They have started to use their own currency. They are no more interested in using the US dollar as a transaction currency, business currency. Now, is that a threat to US dollar nowadays? And are the tech feudal lords trying to decentralize the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little effort on that. Most of the analyses that I trust don't really see things like crypto as being actually all that successful in that regard. One of the analyses that I think is very interesting is Katharina P. Storr, who is a brilliant analyst of Anglo common law, points out that crypto is in some ways too rigid to serve as a currency. It can the world changes, humanity changes. There are lots of unanticipated, we know in our short lifetimes, lots of unanticipated events, and a currency that is that rigid, she argues, isn't actually too fragile for human systems. There are other critiques of that. So that there might be efforts to do that, and they might provide more like investments right now and alternative places. There's so much money sloshing around in the upper classes, right? So alternative ways, it's kind of like there's a thing called the Dutch tulip craze that is kind of a favorite story about when you have an imperial power that's collected all this wealth from other places, money is just sloshing around. Nobody can really do anything constructive with it. And so they start doing things like betting on ridiculous things like tulips for the Dutch back in the day, or cryptocurrency can be one of those places where people put their money, right? So that's one thing that I've seen a lot of really strong dismissals of as a real way of getting out from the dollar hegemony. However, there is a lot of innovation in this area. I noticed one of your interviews was with some people trying to do some finance tech innovation. One of the big ones that is probably most viable is the electronic yuan. So there, the Chinese government is trying to get around this massive system, very expensive system that's attached to global trade, where say somebody who wants to, like a German industrialist who has part of their, his example is like, say they make propellers for fighter craft or something. And some of the production comes from China. They have to go through this massive middleman laden route of exchanging all these currencies before they can
complete the trade.
Yeah, complete the trade. And so the as far as trade with China, an electronic yuan just gets rid of all that middleman stuff. And one of the arguments is that the sort of war in Ukraine has, because the US used that and basically took the Russian central bank's money, that kind of violated the whole kind of global agreement that the US would never really do that. They had the capacity, they had the threat, but in the case of the Ukrainian war, they actually did it for the first time. And what that does is it signals to wealthy people and to countries all around the world that the US is no longer very reliable. And so there's been much more interest in switching over to the electronic yuan since then. And interesting things, that could be, in some ways, there's a lot of problems there in terms of the kind of feudalism that's developing, feudal conditions around the economy. But there's, for Americans, working class Americans, smallholder Americans, like small business Americans, what we call middle class Americans. In my framework, I would call them working class as well, just the top tier. For those people, it's actually a lot better if the US no longer controls the global currency. It does that partly by selling off democracy and the living conditions of average Americans. So
I think it's not only the story of US. Every country trying to compete, they sacrifice their own average class people living. If I take the example of Indian politics or laws, Ambanis and Tatas, the richers just become richer. Here, let's say the tech feudal lords like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, nowadays Sam Altman. So they are just becoming richer, are becoming more richer, and poorer are becoming more poorer. The gap is just increasing nowadays. So what does it mean when we put a question mark on that? It says that when liberalism fails, or are we becoming illiberal?
Right. Yeah, so I do think we're becoming illiberal. Liberalism is becoming its opposite. So a great example is, some of our supposed guardians of liberalism. You can take something like Biden, proclaiming that he's protecting Palestinians, right? If that's a friend, who needs an enemy, right? So yeah, protecting Palestinians by just showering Israel with the bombs that they can use to annihilate Palestinians and then wage war on Lebanon and so forth. That's not liberal, right? And in fact, that's a lie, right? So, and that's part of the illiberalism. So I think that, but it's been a long time in coming, right? So, and I think one of the vulnerabilities of liberalism, political scientist Corey Robin pointed this out a long time ago, is that for a long time, the definition of what liberalism has been, again, I would say for about 80 years, shifted over into a kind of definition of liberalism that is all about tolerating the rise of conservatism, of inequality, that's about being blind to anti-enlightenment, and the massive role it has always played in making egalitarian achievements vulnerable. So I think that we've been living for 80 years with a definition of liberalism. I agree with Samuel Moyn and other people who watched the definition of liberalism being severed from any connection with enlightenment, with egalitarianism, with equality. And increasingly its version of tolerance has been oriented toward facilitating increasingly illiberal, inegalitarian, anti-human development, efforts to constrain human agency. Increasingly, liberalism has been devoted to facilitating that, and guarding strictly against egalitarianism, and expanded human capacitation, right?
So let's say, first of all, I want to explain you. I want you to explain our viewers in simple terms what feudal lords is.
Yeah.
What is feudal lords? What is feudalism? And nowadays, what is tech feudal? And how are we? Then I want to go deeper into how are we shifting from capitalism to tech feudalism, and why is that bad or good for us?
Right. So yeah, that's such a great question. So we'll use Amazon again as a great example. What Amazon basically is that it's Jeff Bezos is a feudal lord, right? And so Amazon is not a market. It's a feudal, we can say it's a feudal demesne, or it's a feudal landscape, basically. And what all the businesses that sell things on Amazon is they're basically vassals. And so they're allowed to sell things on Amazon, but then the algorithms that Bezos employs on Amazon regulate them, what they can sell, who can sell in that marketplace, what the prices are, that kind of thing. And what's going on there is that the rest of us, so that's kind of a vassal class. Then there's a class of tech workers who we can think of in some ways as kind of serfs to this. They don't have a lot of control over their work. They don't have the capacity to innovate and branch out on their own. And I noticed you've done a lot of good interviews with, like startup tech. But places big feudal businesses like Amazon shut down the capacity, the space to develop those kinds of markets, right? They do so much control. And then what everyday people become is we are logged onto our machines and we just give all this information about this cultural information, this psychological information, geographic information about our movements, our moods, who we are, what we love, what our preferences are. We don't just give it over. Then the algorithms start to direct us and control us. And we become, in that sense, kind of serfs. We're giving over so much of monetizable data for free. And that's like a serf, that's like a servant. That's not a position of power, right?
Exactly,
and it's
yeah.
creating this increasing inequality in ability to set the agenda, to run politics, to direct judiciaries and lawyers and law. All that is being concentrated in the billionaires and multimillionaires that own these kind of feudal landscapes, something like Amazon, right?
And we are the peasants of those feudal landscapes.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So we lose a lot of political control and even control over who we are becoming, right? So a great example is, we all know we have no control over environmental crisis. So countries like Bangladesh are just being flooded. Coastal cities, small, like there's massive migration that's already been induced from climate crises. And this really upends people. That's not like, yay, we're coming to Canada because we chose it. It's about people losing the human networks that they've been in, their knowledge, their place-based knowledge, right? So they're losing so much. They're being upended and thrown around the world to places where, like, so your fiance, right? She's a dentist, but she loses recognition of her dental knowledge, right? So she has to do education again, and that's expensive. You lose money and time. So that's kind of some of the loss that's incurred from things like climate crisis and the warfare that results from all these conflicts that are somewhat based in, or can be based in that. And we don't have a capacity to reverse that. We've noticed that. We can't, despite all the good will in the world, climate, the temperature is increasing every year. Climate crises get worse and worse, right? We're in fire NATO territory, right? So things are getting more and more crisis prone. And we're seeing more and more crises. Disease-borne crises are part of that. We have no ability to really change that because we don't have distributed power. For all of our recognition that our lives would be better if we could reduce climate crisis, we don't get to make decisions anymore. We're serfs.
We are manipulated into thinking what we are thinking right now.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like, I think most of our generation is into Instagram, or like they spend the screen time of average 4 to 5 hours a day,
right,
looking on social media, what is going, which is a useless information that they're being fed to.
Yeah.
Most of our generation easily gets distracted. Let's say the event happened, the Ukraine event happened, then the celebrity divorces happened, Johnny Depp.
Right.
Now in India, the big fat Indian wedding happened. Everybody is on that. Like now, the whole Instagram is mad over that.
Yeah.
Everything covers that. So how do you suggest we do escape from this? Do we have any ability to think of our own thoughts, to make up our own thoughts, to see what we actually know ourselves, how we know ourselves? Do we have any ability over that? How do you suggest we do that?
Yeah, well, the world is complex. Humans are complex, and there things we can never, despite all the algorithms in the world. I mean, we don't even understand algorithms, and we don't understand ourselves either. So the beauty is in the complexity, and we do have the capacity. But there's some things that we need to focus on doing that have worked in the past. We've lived in feudalism before, people have, and they do in different parts of the world. There's slavery, it's never gone away. It's been reinforced by empires and so forth. So, but there's some things that people have done in the past. So one of the major things is to pay attention to context and to learn through that Enlightenment context comparative knowledge to keep the communication flow in that like Enlightenment science way as global as possible. And so I think that social science, humanities, arts, physical sciences, these are all knowledges that can come together to play a part in that. I always recommend Thomas Piketty's Capital and Ideology. It has really strong recommendations based in history, he's got a whole network of people working around the world on trying to figure out this question, right? And so Varoufakis in Techno-Feudalism, his final chapter reinforces some of these solutions. So they are things like business, we have to retake over who controls decisions in businesses. That is a major thing to focus on. So business needs to become more democratic. We need to recover our capacity to share ideas, information, and grievances and make decisions together. That is a capacity that humans really have. It's one of our fundamental capacities, and when we don't practice it, we atrophy as creatures, right? And so doing that, right? So that's one of them. Democratize money. So these things like it should not be the kind of money system should not just be owned basically by finance, right? This needs to be democratized. So there's suggestions around that in Thomas Piketty and in Yanis Varoufakis's work. So those are two major things to focus on, as well as to get that enlightenment, to recover that global enlightenment scientific knowledge project, right? And to understand that the anti-enlightenment has been trying to kill it off for many decades, and it needs restoration. The other thing is to look at history and to say, you know what, we are opposed. There is an anti-enlightenment. There's global military coming out of the US. There's global policing. There's so much surveillance technology trying to keep us, make us feudal serfs and keep us that way. And a serf is just another word for a slave. So to deal with that, what people have done in the past, and I always recommend, is rediscover what they did. They formed salons, secret groups where they got together and exchanged information, and they published things in a kind of, they published what they were learning in kind of these secret publications, like these, they had these secret printing presses. And I sort of think that things like blogs and what you do on YouTube are a potential venue. It's not perfectly secret, but they're potential venues for giving people ideas that they can come together, relearn how to organize other people, as Jane McAlevey, the sociologist, was trying to teach people. We have our skill, our basic human skill to organize and communicate has been dismantled by anti-enlightenment, inegalitarian anti-enlightenment policing. We need to recuperate our capacity to meet each other and organize, right? And to learn from each other. So Jane McAlevey is really strong in teaching people how to do that. What is it called? Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung gives classes in how to do that, because many of us, we don't know how to do that, right, anymore. That's a human skill that's been taken away from us. So some really clear things that we can do, I think. We can, and looking at kind of building independent knowledge, democratizing work, democratizing money, and recognize, have patience, recognize it's going to be a long haul. Like the French Enlightenment, as Piketty will say, accomplished a lot. It did move things forward. Things like the Haitian Revolution really set back slavery for a long time. It dismantled much of France's slavery imperial infrastructure, but the Haitian people have been punished ever since. So there is a lot of it's going to be contested. There's going to be pain. It's going to take a long time, but as Thomas Piketty says over and over again, it is effective. We can move forward in reclaiming human capacity for developing, for exercising agency, and that includes organizing and communicating with each other, making decisions together so that all people can thrive. Not so that we have some great feudal lords, right? Monopolizing all the decision-making power, with a lot of people's lives being stunted, early deaths, disease, no control over things like their own environment. That's not a human thing. Humans should have some control over their environment. We're being dehumanized. So those are some of the ways I think that there can be pushback. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does answer the question beautifully. And that's a great segue into also learning. You earlier mentioned the startups, the startup arena, right? It's being dismantled. It's new industries are not allowed to develop. Also, what I have also heard and learned a little bit, that big companies back in India, like Reliance from Ambani, it takes over in every industry, goes to every industry, dismantles that industry, owns that industry then, and doesn't allow new startups to move forward, who can give a cheaper and better solution for longer term. For example, what they did is they started giving free internet around 6-7 years ago. The Geo started, they started giving free internet, free SIM cards to people for 1-2 years. Then every other telecommunications companies were destroyed, and then they started charging even more so than what earlier the prices was a long-term gain. But that's how they actually fooled the public, and then giving the, I would say, not as good as quality network that could have been provided together.
It's a classic move. I would sometimes call it the IKEA move. You start off with like a beautiful product, right? And then you start substituting in, sawdust, basically, after people have become hooked on it. And that's what you can do with a buildup in economic inequality. You can take some of that money, control the political realm, some of that money control legal formation, and some of that money you can just use to offer things for free, so long as to get rid of competition and to get rid of things like innovation, right? That is not controlled by Jeff Bezos or people like him, Elon Musk, and so forth. So I think, people have to work together. These other aspects are really important. Having these conversations, learning about, well, what's free that's just a kind of come on, that's going to bring you into a more unfree relationship, a more slavery type commercial relationship, and what are the ways in which, and this is another really important thing that I think Varoufakis brings out, we can democratize the internet, right? And really make it a collective commons, right? So the internet, that kind of technology needs to be a commons. That's where the real democratic startups, I think, would try to contribute to that. And land needs to be a commons, so that we don't have this constant dynamic of these billionaires just like gobbling up land in Canada and the US as part of this system of building their insane hierarchy, right?
So what Yanis says, also in one of his subjects, he mentions that the tech feudalism is driven by these companies, that it's just, nowadays the goal is actually the data. Data is what they need, data is what they collect, and in future many tech tech nerds I've heard is they are afraid of giving the data because
Mm-hmm.
collecting data
Mm-hmm.
is going to be utilized in a very, very destructive way, such
Right.
that it's going to be difficult to move around with freedom.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So, can modern technology be actually helpful,
Mm-hmm.
or it can lead us to a not comfortable society?
Right. So I think humans are always going to innovate, but actually by creating severe social hierarchies, you suppress innovation. First, it seems like you're just channeling it. But when it's all for the thriving of just a few people at the expense of not just the rest of humanity, but the expense of life on Earth, you are actively suppressing innovation. One of my favorite theorists is Andreas Wagner in developmental biology. And one of the ways that he talks about life on Earth is it's all innovative. Humans are innovative. We are innovating all the time. What is happening with social hierarchy is we're suppressing innovation to only channel up that kind of innovation that creates ridiculous comfort and excess capacity at the top of the social hierarchy at the cost of pain, short lives, thwarted innovation, thwarted agency throughout most of humanity, and is really coming at the expense of life on Earth, biodiversity, right? We need to foreground, and this includes people working in tech, right? Amazingly, in tech, people need to foreground what is unique about this time we have on Earth, right? Which is that we should all get to develop, innovate, and express our agency. We should all get to thrive. That needs to be the goal. It can be lost if we get this mechanistic mindset that we're just trying to, optimize some little mechanical system, and we lose track of the big picture. We lose track of the comparative information and knowledge. We have no way of we give up our capacity to make judgment, and we have that capacity. So I would say there's plenty of room for tech. So one of my favorite cases is what happened in the Netherlands with lots of attempts to democratize tech. And then all of a sudden, all sorts of people are participating. Women are innovating in tech, high tech, right? Ooh, oh my God, they're doing that with fallopian tubes and everything, right? Well, that's happening because it's not a social network that's trying to constrain who benefits, right? I think I do think that there's always going to be innovation. That's what humans do, but it's a matter of what your values are in innovating, and can you notice the difference between a free first offer that's backed up by slavery and something that's a commons shared by everyone. And there you maybe need a little bit of education, maybe beyond the narrow mechanistic education, right?
Exactly.
And curiosity, right? Yeah.
So do you think that this mechanistic, or let's say herd mentality, that most of us are being driven by, we are trying to optimize the system, which we shouldn't be doing. We are actually making the system better, through which the rich people, those monarchs, will benefit from them. That's what everybody are doing. They are trying to score jobs under their in their companies to make them profitable. But nowadays it's being changed by the people who have the guts to go out of their way from their actually given education from schools and universities, the thought process driven from their parents. They are actually going out of that box and creating something for themselves. That's why the startups number has risen in past many years. So do you think that this education that we are being given in this amount of terms, or the motivation that we are being given while we are studying, is also I would say, controlled.
Yeah, we are living in an age where there's a lot of discourse around the model of education should be just like basically training, right? Even in like engineering of any sort, right? And then you're supposed to just get a job, hop into one of the very few companies, right? And just like have this career there, right? And that's because those people have, again, the people who own such companies have so much lobbying power, so much ability to control media, to control political parties, to control boards of governance and the administrations at universities, and even who's hired as profs, right? So that's a tendency that I think is very strong in universities today. Most of the labor market, or even the possibilities out there that are more innovative, like these startup companies, that's most of what most of us are going to have access to, right? So to me, the sort of trying to channel people's imagination, innovative imagination, into just piling on the aggrandizement of these giant companies that are basically owning a lot of information about people. That's like their main power, right? And we're giving that to them for free. Basically trying to challenge or channel people into that, as that's what the point of university is. I think also guts the university over time, right? And it guts human capacity for innovation, true innovation, like going outside the box. And so much of our lives are going to be outside the box unless it's really just reduced to slavery, right?
Yeah.
So we have to learn to innovate with each other, to work with each other, organize, communicate, and think outside the boxes that are imposed by these. The first one's free, and after that, you are stuck with this monopolized system of total control, right?
Right.
Is that a little complex, or do you have a way of...
So what I would say is, like, to simplify it better, let's say that you have to go out and search for information for your purpose, and not just keeping head down and study whatever you are doing. Rather, go out, be aware of yourself. I would say most of our generation is not aware of themselves.
Yeah, they lose themselves. Yeah,
they're lost. They are just lost in what they are being manipulated to, the what information they are being given on social media. They are considering it true. Many of the people I meet, they give information what they've heard, but they have never investigated by their own.
Right.
They are believing what they are being told by some people,
yeah,
but they did not take effort to validate that information or go out and search the information. Internet is free, it's available to everyone, and I think if you go and search the information, you will get a better information rather than the information that's already incoming.
Right. And I have to say, I do think universities serve a role in directing people to the better information. So what I'm always trying to convince people to do is learn to respect and make friends with librarians. They can direct you to all sorts of new worlds of information, that kind of comparative, contextualized information that you won't get if you're being narrowly turned into a serf, or being narrowly turned into an instrument for someone else's glory and aggrandizement.
So we are talking about university. You are being the voice of this Enlightenment movement. Don't you feel afraid? Have you ever felt like that? Because what I've heard is many people's voice have been suppressed. Let's say your voice just got bigger. What do you think about it? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I would say that that's real, right? So that's why I talk a little bit about looking at the past, looking at the ways in which people bolstered themselves by working a little bit more clandestinely. So I would say, or proliferating things like other venues of knowledge, right? Or working with librarians, right, who really are trying to help people get knowledge that they're not just being channeled into. And I would say, yeah, you get attacked. You do get attacked. We're living in an age where people get attacked for saying true things. But I would also say it's worth it, right? Like I mean, I have students who they need a future. I think the earth needs a future. I think life is amazing. I have a son who I want him to, I don't think he'll live in a better world. I don't think you will either, but I think you can help make it better. And my job is to support people in getting footholds and trying to figure out some good paths to beginning to build toward recuperating human, distributed, universal human capacities, their agency, their innovation, their communicative capacity, their organizing capacity to thrive, right? So that's kind of, yes, you're going to get disrespected. You're going to be silenced. You might, in many places, be put in prison. You definitely won't get jobs in many places, including in North America, right? If you, so there are costs, but there are also people out there who are willing to protect you. They may not be immediately around you, so you have to think about the wider world, right? Make those bigger connections, because there will be people out there who will have your back, and there will be maybe, and you can recuperate. You're a human, right? Humans develop their whole lives along. So
Yes, we have survived since longest.
And we've got a long lifespan. Even each of us can develop despite being under attack.
Yes. What would you say, what new age tech tools can we use, what new age technology we can use to be responsible, to not drive us to more inequality, but protect us ourselves from that? And as an individual, what would you recommend? As an individual, what should a person like me do on a regular basis to rewire ourselves and be, don't go into that inequality process, but rather, I would say, develop ourselves?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the skill set that you have that I don't have, and I think that you've been talking about with people, so I love the language that I'm hearing from some of the people you've interviewed. They're talking about thinking strategically, right? And being curious and learning from other people and going out and seeking that higher quality information. I'm recognizing the limitedness of what the information is coming into them and going beyond that, right? I've heard a lot of your interviewees talk about that. So I think that is a skill that can be in that maybe people are allowed to do in pursuing tech and finance tech and those kinds of things, and you can just expand that to other areas of life, right? Like you are, right, with doing this podcast. I would say that I don't know, that's not my expertise. I can't, specify particular things. All I can say is work on thinking about the commons when you're developing technology and engaging with technology. Think about it in terms of, is this the property of everyone and can it always be? Or is somebody just giving me something free, again, briefly, before they make me their slave, right? And is that person a capitalist? Because that's usually who's going to do, in a position to do that and supported by states to do that. But everyday rejuvenation, is that kind of what you're talking about as well? So everyday rejuvenation, I think, is about recognizing that you are human on Earth and you've got specific capacities. So you develop, your whole bodily health, right? We are, a good way of thinking about this, theorists that I really like, Elaine Scarry or Joseph Fracchia, talk about this. This is coming from the Marxist tradition. humans aren't just like brains floating in a vat and then bodies to be used. Humans are thinking bodies, right? And so you treat yourself well, right? Like you think about sleep and all those great things like sleep and love and being with other people and touching grass and like being outside and moving your body and just getting to experience life on Earth. And part of that is human, right? It's social. Learning from other people, including by reading, right? Reading is learning from other people, but being curious. All that I think is rejuvenating. I think avoiding imprisonment in all its forms as much as possible. Imprisonment is about stunting people. It's about constraining them. So there are many different forms. I think we really underestimated in the pandemic how much we were hurting human development, and we're reaping that right now. And it was a conversation that we should have been starting then. We're hurting people by constraining them and isolating them from other people. That is something that hurts humans, right? And so we need to recognize that people have been hurt and they need support. They need to recuperate. I think about this as the mom of an 18-year-old. There's a lot of care that we all need. And part of that is, I'm going to say, sometimes you look at, there are spiritual traditions. I always, perhaps, like, I'm a materialist, so but I do go to these concepts of humans need to develop, right? And they need to enjoy as much exposure to movement and parks and green life and other animals and human contact and conversations as possible.
That's a very deep statement, I would say. Needs to be well thought what you were saying, actually, that imprisonment in all of its forms, that's being using the technology, using the Apple phones, using the laptops, using the social media, being responsible on the social media. I think that's all the forms of imprisonment that most of our generation is facing today.
Right.
Now, if I would say, like, I've heard many people say that the public knowledge that's being given by those very motivational big people is usually the way that they want other people to go towards. And in person, when they give the advice to their closed ones, that advice has come out to be that you need to improve health, focus on your health. That's it.
That's right. Oh yeah.
So it's completely opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's famous by now, right? Like tech moguls don't let their children do screens, right? Because they know the screens are built to enslave, right? And that means to stunt human development, which is painful over time. The physical pain that we feel the same kind of pain from psychological anguish, right? That's, our brains are processing it all. So in the same way. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's become almost a truism now, that billionaire elites, tech moguls, don't let their own beloved families be enslaved the way that they make money off of other people and young people, right? So yeah, I would say for young people, they keep reaching out to each other, form the salons, be curious, exchange ideas, find new, do treasure hunts of better knowledge together, and just play together, be outdoors and so forth, right? Like, so make music together, be innovative in all the ways that humans are innovative. I think that that's going to be, my hope is that everybody living can support each other, but young people who've been kind of under siege with these slavery technologies
Even the kids, 5-year-olds, have started using the
Right.
tech
Yeah.
nowadays, which
Yeah.
is not helpful. Obviously, people are forgetting nature, many of them, but also the other half, after post-COVID,
Hmm.
has learned what nature is and
Yeah.
what real human connection is. They've started valuing that.
Right.
So,
Right. Yep.
do you feel that it's a nice point of segue that we can go into decentralized form?
Hmm.
That do you think that governments will matter? Do governments matter anymore, or will they matter in the future? Are we going towards a decentralized global way, be it finance, be it governance?
Governments are always necessary to, they're part of the legal apparatus, right? So they're always necessary to, and you need a legal apparatus even to have property and inequality.
But will it matter in the future? Will
Yeah.
these feudal lords let it survive?
Let governments survive. They need governments. Governments serve feudal lords. But they do control. I mean, there's a lot of control too. So the U.S. controls other countries and other capitalists, but global capitalists also control U.S. policy, right? There's a bit of a feedback loop, really, with billionaires and multimillionaires at the top of it, right?
So government is basically the middleman helping the global
Yeah,
lords control the other lords.
right. And it doesn't have to be that way. People always need to, governments are, you can think about governments, they rules are written down and they enforce rules. We will always need rules. If we wanted to have a decentralized, egalitarian society where everybody's life mattered and everybody could develop, we would need to enforce limits on the people who wanted to take advantage of that to, again, enslave other people. So my favorite example is from the Norwegian case. It was, I'm trying to think, Fridell, what is his name now? He changed his name. But basically, he was an egalitarian Norwegian, and he wanted to get rid of what equality institutions had been built in Norway. And so what he did is, one of the great equality institutions of Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Sweden, is that their prison systems don't crush people. They don't handicap them. They don't destroy them as the Anglo-American ones do. They really are focused on rehabilitation. So how do you support someone to develop into a human being who can share development with other people around them, doesn't take from other people? So it's kind of how their prison systems are built. This guy, Fridell, whatever his last name was, he made up this name. What he did is, to get rid of it, he went on a killing spree and killed a bunch of children at a political party, their kids' summer camp. So he just killed dozens and dozens of children, just went and gunned them down. And so he kind of challenged the egalitarian state. What are you going to do with me now? You can't abide someone like me in your society. Or if you do, I will, so you've got to change this prison system. You've got to introduce the death penalty. You've got to punish me, right, for having killed all your children. And the interesting response of the Norwegian government was to say, you're not going to change our view of criminal justice and rehabilitation. We're going to keep you in prison we're going to keep a boundary. We're going to keep a law. As long as you want to destroy distributed human life chances, like distributed thriving, we're not going to let you do that. You do have to live in prison, but we don't have to crush your soul. You can have video games in prison if you want. Yeah, knock yourself out, become a slave to the screen, whatever you want to do, but you can't destroy our system of trying to keep boundaries on people like you, right? So it's called the Jantelagen problem. And so we're always going to have states that We're always going to have collectively agreed upon rules. We're going to have to be able to come together like they did in the first Icelandic tingy, their first legislation, and exchange ideas, information, and grievances, because we always change and the world always changes. But we have to have governments with laws that guard against the things that will completely undermine society. So in an egalitarian society, that is the right to take other people's life.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense to me. Okay.
So there's no withering away of the state completely, I think. Or if so, it's at some point where we're no longer quite the humans we are now. Right.
You also mentioned in one of the topics the events like Red Hunt, Islamophobia. Can you explain a little into detail how does that teach us from the history?
Yeah, so that's part of the Anti-Enlightenment, right? So to try to get rid of working class capacity to organize, to try to eradicate that, there were instituted in a lot of countries, but particularly in the US is the case I'm most familiar with, the Red Hunt. And so this is sometimes called the Red Scare. So basically it's always put under this idea of we're just trying to get rid of illiberalism. We're trying to get rid of communism. But what it really is there were many people who'd come into, say, for example, US government during the Great Depression who were coming from all sorts of different ideas and social positions, and they were coming in there with new innovations that would allow for more broad sharing of thriving, right? So the US had gone through, along with much of the world, a very inegalitarian period. And that was very just exploding in all these wars, World War I, World War II, and so forth. So in the 30s, all people from all sorts of different positions in societies, workers, what we would call middle class people and so forth, they were able to participate in innovating new ways of, say, having education. So expand it so that all the men, right, could have education, and then expand it from there so all the women could have education, and improve it so that African Americans' education wasn't just about punishing them, but allowing them to, again, be supported to thrive and develop. So all sorts of like these innovative programs were being developed to support broader thriving. And it wasn't perfection immediately. It cannot be. It takes so long to expand égale liberté. But the way that was dismantled was by trying to destroy working class people's capacity to organize. So that's what the Red Hunt was. It was removing all these people from various decision-making positions across government. So there were people who were working in the Forest Service on making forests like a commons where people could both get food but also recreate and so forth, and that it would still support trees and biodiversity. So they were working on really innovative plans for that. They were kicked out of office under this idea that they were communists, they were illiberal, right? And they were all replaced with inegalitarians who helped kind of move us towards this neoliberal world, or this sort of techno-feudal world where we've been building. So that was one of the kind of victories of the Anti-Enlightenment, which is silently mobilizing with the help of lots of people who could only see violence coming out of revolution and enlightenment and equality. So that was one of the things. And then it moves to like our problem today. We eradicated, Vincent Bevins wrote a great book called The Jakarta Method. And he looks at what happened in Indonesia, right? So the US military and CIA went in there and they trained the Indonesian government and participated themselves in killing off all these people with the capacity to develop more egalitarian governance structures and infrastructure and so forth, and kind of culture and that kind of thing. So they killed them off, and that was kind of the model for what the CIA did around the world. So they got rid of communists, illiberal communists, that is to say organizers, egalitarian organizers, and they replaced them with religious fundamentalists. It was a huge part of the US military's idea of how you govern poor people. So in the US military, they even, like, after World War II, got rid of a lot of their psychology staff and replaced them with Christian fundamentalist ministers to kind of help minister to and control their soldiers. Abroad, the US military replaced egalitarians, capacitating government workers all over. They put them in jail. They had them killed. They all over the world this was done, and they replaced them with fundamentalist religions, right? Yes. And so we're living with that world today, right? That was built by the US military and the CIA. They felt that they could govern societies controlled by these patriarchal fundamentalist religions. They felt that was compatible with US military rule and CIA interpretations of American interests, which are elite, global elite interests more so than everyday American interests. So now we have the backlash of that. We've disrupted all these societies. The US has, for example, but the whole Anglo-American empire. We've disrupted all these societies, made them constantly embroiled in war, and decapacitated a lot of their population. And then we pretend that we're going in and saving the women, like saving the Afghani women, when what we did was we set up the religious patriarchies to begin with, right? And in order to have that kind of top-down control. So then one of the ways of dealing with the kind of crises that have been created around the world with this religious fundamentalism replacing human capacitation is that we've, like the West tries to develop a kind of a politics of like Islamophobia or anti-South Asian or anti-Middle Eastern or whatever kind of racist sort of politics that are stuck in this notion of some kinds of humans are naturally fundamentalist. And that's the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is people want to develop their own capacities and they're being stunted and thwarted. They're too much imprisonment, too much serfdom, too much slavery, not enough support for human development. So there's a real, I think that these kinds of campaigns, like scares against illiberal populations that might be communist back in the past or Middle Eastern today, like Palestinian or Lebanese or what have you, or Muslim, right? All of these kinds of scare campaigns about this is where the illiberalism comes from. No, the call is coming from inside the house. The illiberalism is coming from the liberal regime itself, right?
Right. Very interesting.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm I think it takes a lot of explaining contra the kind of
agreed.
Yeah. The easily available information, right?
Yeah. To clarify what is true information and what is the wrong information.
Yeah.
So moving on to the last section is that many people who which motivated people should follow sociology and criminology. What drove you here? What actually has driven you to this field? And what type of people should be driven to this field and take interest?
Yeah. So what drove me to the field is that the work of Cornelia and Jan Flora. So they are American sociologists, and what I was particularly interested in their research agenda. They researched in some ways that I can't replicate, right? Like in that era, they had government forward funding, but they also used it to, again, really focus on who are the populations, these rural populations where all the resources are being sucked out of of their communities, where they live. All the pollution is being dumped on them. They're being sickened, stunted. They don't have enough supports. They don't have the supports we humans need to develop. Their fight to develop politically, much like, again, Vincent Bevins talks about, is being thwarted, right? And so the Floras were really trying to figure out how to help people recognize all their different assets and hang on to them and work on developing them together. So a couple things I liked about that focus on human development should be central, right? Shared human development should be central. I really loved that idea and wanted to pursue that in sociology. And the second one is learning from people around the world, right? Partly we do that through books, but partly we do it, again, librarians, listening to podcasts, meeting in secret salons, just kind of being curious, going out in the world and interviewing, talking to people. That's why interviewing is a scientific technique like anything else, right? Like all this way of gathering high quality information from different points of view around the world, not just the same top-down blaring kind of message of that's trying to constrain what people know.
Right.
Right.
According to your secret circles,
Yeah.
what does global economy look like right now, and what is the trend it's following? Is it going to be rising? It's going to be falling for mediocre people, the average class working people?
Yeah, it's not looking good. I'm very concerned about that. We can talk about, as some economists do, that India and particularly Chinese populations increased in terms of wealth over the past era in which inequality was massively growing in the West. But you're talking about moving from less than $1 a day to $2 a day. In a world of billionaires, there's still not much you can do with that, right? That's still a problematic social formation, and there's no indication that that's actually spreading, right? And Thomas Piketty would make the point that it cannot under conditions of capitalism. Varoufakis would make the point, things are getting worse. We're moving into a serfdom kind of relationship where most people are giving things over for free, and they're not, and they're being excluded from decision making, and being able to kind of work together to shape their world. So I think we're in what's called an abeyance period in sociology. That's a period where you are trying to regroup, identify what capacities you have, and you want to fight to reclaim. And recognize that you're going to do that over your whole lifetime, and it might take a few generations. There's going to be, with a lot of organizing, there's going to be advancement and pushback. But again, I'm with Thomas Piketty. You do get, by making the effort, you can push past serfdom and slavery, high exploitation, expropriation.
And if you push, as an individual, if you pushed past that, is it looking good on the other end for you, or?
Yeah, I agree with him. I think that there's been I agree with Piketty. I think that there's been from kind of slave societies, particularly like in European slave societies, there's been advancement toward more shared human development. So I do see that. I do think that there's always that possibility. And also just because you can't predict, right? We do our best to predict and control. But again, very complex world, and we are complex creatures. So I would say, yeah, I'm always optimistic in change and human capacities. We just need to recognize that we have capacities and keep fighting for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Push beyond the limits of your own.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So right now, I would say the last tip that we want from you is, if you are in this part of the world, which is North America, or if you are in a European world, or if you are in Asia, for all sorts, I think that's the mass distribution of people. What would you advise? Which side looks better, and how to make your future better?
Yeah. So, I mean, just foreground your own development and innovation, and know that as a human, you're social and you need to share that with other people around you. Don't just share it with your family. Don't just share it with like your bros or whatever, right? Those conditions are, they can be easily, you're just like a little, in today's high inegalitarian world, that's not enough, right? So I would say lots of innovation has come from all around the world, and I can't predict what it will be. So just recognize your own capacity for innovation and agency, and that's sacred, and protect your well-being and as many people around you, and be curious, try to learn from people around the world, and head out into the world, or at least read and hit up those like non-mainstream blogs and that kind of thing, and sort of try to work with librarians. They're great. Find quality information, right? And in this, you've got a long lifespan, hopefully, if you're able to get the support to take care of yourself. So you'll have time to develop your whole life long. And really, it's amazing, right? So awesome. That's kind of what I would say. Like, there's nothing, the U.S. and Canada are in a bit of their innovation is going to come from around the world. So we need to, but we don't know how we need to be able to bring that together. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Mara, for your entire time. And I hope this is going to be amazing for the viewers who are actually interested in self-development.